Hello and welcome to another interview on the Inonda podcast. Find out more at inonda.co.uk.
When it comes to negotiation, is there any good books? What are you reading at the moment? Because that's
So the one I'm reading, it's a classic. It was actually, I think, written in the 70s. It was written by a Harvard professor, and he's known for doing a lot of the negotiations like throughout the Middle East and others. He was a veteran in World War II. And the title of the book is How to Get to Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. He's got some interesting concepts. He really gets into a bit of the emotional aspect and the thinking around negotiations and how to get collaboration instead of combative. Some of the basic principles are most people negotiate your position. So you start, I want to pay $300,000 for this house, or I'm not going to take less than $350,000. And really what you have to get to is what people's interests are. The reason why their position is they won't pay more than $300,000 is they can't afford more than a 10% down payment of $30,000. So they can't pay more than $300,000. Or I can't take less than $350,000 because my loan on the house to pay off the mortgage is $325,000. So if you get to what people's real interests are that drive their position, you can get to a point where you're helping each other solve the problems, and that you realize that it's not just up to you to solve the other person's problem, and you got to think creatively, and you can collaborate. And his most simple example is if there's only one lemon and you and your wife both need the lemon, you're kind of at a standstill. But if you ask, why does your wife need the lemon? And it's for her, she needs the juice of the lemon to make her cake. And you need the zest of the lemon because you're cooking a meal. Well, if you give her the flesh and you take the zest, you both have it. Now you've been able to collaborate, negotiate, and you both satisfy your interests because your position was, I need the lemon.
I like that.
No worries.
But I like that idea of taking the zest and taking the juice, because until you understand and get down to the nitty gritty, you may feel like you both need something, but in reality, you both can work together to get the thing that you want.
Yeah. He has a really good example as well called the 18th Camel. So he tells the story of a sultan who passes away, and in his will, he has 3 sons. So he leaves his sons, he has 17 camels. And he leaves the first son half of the camels. And the second son, he leaves a third of the camels. And the third son gets a ninth of the camels. Well, 17, half, third, 9, nothing's divisible in whole numbers. So the sons are having arguments, and someone recommends that there's a wise old woman down the street that you should go talk to her and see if she can help you solve your problem. So they go to the old woman. She listens to their issue, and she says, well, I actually have a camel that I don't need. I'm happy to give you one more camel. So she gives him the 18th camel. Well, half the camels are 9. A third of the camels, 18 is 6. They have 15 camels. And the ninth of 18 camels is 2 camels. That's 17 camels. They have 1 left over, and they give the woman back her camel. So how does that work, right? So he's like, you need to think outside the box and think of solutions that aren't necessarily apparent, and work together and collaborate and think of unique ways to get to, how do you get to yes and be able to work together.
Yeah. I was just off the back actually of a really big, bid, and I was in the call, and I think I could have done with this interview beforehand.
All right.
Yeah, because sometimes you do. You know what I've learned in sales is that a lot of one of the things that was my misconception is that you have to be this linguistic wizard to be able to be good at sales, when in reality, it's just being very helpful and thinking creatively and being able to ask the right questions to be able to help. And that's first and foremost, in my opinion.
Absolutely. We see that so much when we deal with product marketing.
Yeah.
And people that are, or even product management, when the teams are so close to the features and components and the technology itself, they want to speak about the technologies and those features. And when we help them rewrite their scripts, it's really to simplify, which is very, very difficult to do, right? To get a complex thought or a complex message, or maybe something that's comprehensive in sales and you want to tell them about all you can do, but you need to explain it in their terms and their value. You need to do it in simple and something they can consume and understand. And that's why in the past we focused on technology, is because it's so complex and difficult to get a simple message across. Just helping them think through what is the real value for the customer and what do they want to hear in simple terms is probably some of the biggest value that we deliver to our customers. It's hard. It's hard to do.
It is because you're in it and you can't see the woods from the trees a lot of the time. It's you've spent so much hard work in developing such complexities that trying to make it simple, what is simple to you is not simple to the customer who hasn't spent the years or decades on it.
Exactly.
You know, I've found that I've had some really interesting conversations. This brilliant guys who, like, recently, even this week, they've got this satellite technology. It's insane. It sounds amazing, but the guy explaining it, I had to be 100% fully locked and loaded in, because if I missed the beat, I wouldn't have known what the hell they were on about. How do you get that out of product managers, or what? Because that's a gift. Because I'm sure that a lot of people
Yeah.
understand how difficult it is to.
The biggest thing I think we try to teach them is empathy, which is very hard, right? So if you can empathize with the person, so putting yourself in their shoes and understand what are they hearing and what do they need to hear. That, again, we focus on channels mainly, many times. And channels, I've worked with manufacturers that have been working in channels for 20 plus years. And when we explain to them the economics, basically how much does each player, or how much does their partner actually make in the economic model to take products to market, they're floored. They think that everybody thinks the other player's making a ton of money. And they never really put themselves in the other person's shoes and figure out just basic math, right? So if you make this much, customer pays this much, how much is actually divvied up along the value chain? And when they walk through it, they're just floored. So I think teaching empathy, teaching them about the other person's business, even your customer. That's why, discovery and understanding your customer's business, what that really means is understanding their perspective, their pains, the things that they go through each day. And if you do that, it becomes very clear, right? But my objective for a printer isn't to have 150 sheets printed in a single tray before I have to reload it. Something simple like that. Well, what my real goal is, I don't want to have to stand in front of the printer when I'm printing out multiple booklets. I want to be able to send a print job and not have to change out the paper every 5 minutes. That's really what I care about, right? It's not that I want a 500 sheet tray feed, right? I don't care about that. But I do care about not standing in front of the printer and wasting my time.
Hmm.
As simple as that, I think. Or we did a whole series, I remember years ago, on what can you do with a laptop without software. Because, hardware manufacturers, the reps don't think about, what else do I need to sell with this thing? So what can you do with a laptop? We had a whole video of using it as a cocktail shaker, like a swim board, a door stop, right? Like, what else are you going to do with it if it doesn't have software to run it? So just making salespeople stop and think about, okay, when I sell someone a laptop, what are they doing with it? Well, how do they use it? And we use ourselves as case studies, excuse me, where we travel internationally. We not only buy a laptop, but back in the day, we used to buy 2 and 3 backup batteries. We'd buy a case, we'd buy a mouse, we'd buy a pen because we teach on tablets. We were like the accessory dream because we were power users of that laptop. It was our tool to communicate with everyone. So any type of accessory or way that made me productive or allowed me to communicate using my laptop or my tool to communicate to someone else, I'd want to do it. And all they needed to ask us was, what do you do? What do you plan? How are you going to use this? And we would tell them like crazy, this accessory, we're a solution dream. But you have to ask the question and actually want to hear what's happening. So I think empathy is the best way to do it.
How do you come up with those creative concepts? Because that's not the first time I've heard you come up with something cool. When you talked about using the laptop, what can it do without the software?
Yeah.
I had the referee. Um, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. How do you come up with those ideas?
Wow. The really wonderful thing, I've been really blessed with a incredibly, wonderfully creative and curious team.
Hmm.
Not all, I happen to come from selling technology and servicing technology and engineers for 30 years. But, the person that may be writing some of the scripts, or the videographer or director or someone building the set or the video and post, or the designers haven't. They've been exposed to it as long as they've worked for me, but they actually don't understand technology from that perspective. And it's really some of the most wonderful contribution, because they're the customer, right? They're not technology folks. So they look at it and say, so why are we talking about the USB port, or what does that matter? Or
Yeah.
the difference most recently was the difference between an inkjet printer and a laser printer. Like, I could talk about that for an hour, which is incredibly boring, but it's interesting when you look at it from a perspective of, why are we talking to someone from that perspective? And I have a team that, because they're so dedicated to delivering a result via their medium, whether it's design or video or content, I get to collaborate and they come up with the most wonderful ideas. So I'm sure maybe I contribute a little bit, but I give them the perspective, or I'll give them the information around the technology, and my team comes up with just incredible ideas, and we ideate. So we also, when we deploy to a project, we deploy in teams. So even the smallest project to the largest project, we deploy. There's a visual designer. There's someone who does something typically with video, even if it's not originally scoped, but someone director that could think about the possibility. There's someone like me, a consultant that's on there, and there's a content writer or an instructional designer. So there's a team of people. If you're making a 1 to 3 minute video with us, or if you're making a 20-minute e-learning, or you're developing a whole program, you're getting the creative input and perspective of our whole team.
Hmm. How does because one of the questions I got asked is about in person. Like this was for building out a sales team, and they're like, "Oh, we're considering it in person because we want people to rub shoulders." I know that you and Jeff have mentioned like having some fun in the hotel lobbies when you first started the company. But
Oh
like,
yeah, sure.
so when you get the team together, is it online? Is it in person? Because you've got a lovely office as well. How do you go
Yeah.
about? Yeah,
Well, our approach for the past 16 years really hasn't changed much, although I would say the inflection, and I'll describe that. Our approach has always been a blended modality. We were, in our origin, we were known as internet tuition. So, online subscription. Intuition was the name of the company when it was first founded. And that was because we were delivering e-learning very early on. However, it was really adopted as pre-work to level set. And then after you would complete the e-learning, we'd be able to see the range of knowledge and skills with the individuals, because there'd be an assessment at the end. And
yeah,
that would allow us to tailor about an hour virtual classroom, answering questions, maybe giving additional context, and starting to tailor based upon the group. What we saw is the initial results from the e-learning, what we should focus on. And then we would go deliver a 2-day up to a 5-day workshop, anywhere around that time frame, depending on the content, face to face. And after the face to face, people would then, we notice even that evening, take the e-learnings again, because it gave them additional context as they went through, and then the scores would go much higher, and then we'd usually finish with a virtual classroom. So we've always had this blend of modalities to engage with individuals, and they each served a purpose. So in 2007, 2008, when people couldn't travel, we just focused more on the virtual aspect and the e-learning and started to enhance those and the live virtual aspects. And the same thing happened during COVID. We just enhanced our virtual capabilities and our video capabilities and interactivity. When you remove the face-to-face component, I think people do yearn for that, but we were able to replace that with some really interactive live sessions, which, we incorporated a live switch and key out and green screen and really giving that interaction, which is what people want. I think in live, their ability to collaborate and breakout sessions and share peer-to-peer knowledge is what you really do miss from a face-to-face. It's tough to replicate that in a virtual classroom, but we did do that during COVID for sure.
What for you is like the perfect storm when it comes to a learning environment, so that you have a team that take the information in a way that they retain the information, that they are able to utilize and make use of that information and
Yeah.
execute and get better results than they did before they had the training.
Yeah. The success of training, I think I should say this, really is not reliant on the trainer or the content. It's management. So if you ever been in a position where you've worked for someone, you ever been given tasks and the manager never reviews it, never discusses it with you going forward, never inspects it, doesn't seem to care about it. In your quarterly review, none of the components of it matter in your quarterly review. They just care, especially if you're in sales, are your numbers up, are your accounts up, and they're not really getting deeper. So if management doesn't reinforce what we train, no matter what we do, a week-long class, a 3-month class, if they're not reinforcing it or inspecting what they expect a salesperson to do, really getting in and understanding where they might be facing challenges, reviewing the stuff that you do expect, the behaviors that you want them to perform, it won't work. It won't be sustainable because the salesperson is going to do what the manager is looking for. So if you're looking for numbers, I'm just going to focus on a spreadsheet that shows you numbers. If you're asking me things like, so tell me more about what your customer does. Tell me why they would be buying this month or putting it on hold. What's the compelling reason? Or why do we differentiate against competition? What is the additional value we deliver? Asking questions that make the salesperson think about the skill set. That'll tell you how they're doing discovery. That will tell you, do they understand the value? Are they positioning on price or are they positioning on value? So basic questions and reinforcement from the management team is the single most depending factor, I'd say, on the success of a learning program.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because a lot of the time, like you mentioned, I had a call today and we were focused on dial rates. And you look at some numbers and sometimes they don't tell a true story, because if you come from cold calling, you can make 10 calls and they're really well researched and you're taking your time to understand who the prospect is and they're really hot leads. You can make 100 calls and just kind of be robotic on the phone and not really say much. Which one is it KPI? Which one's
Actually going to fulfill or drive something?
Yeah, it's really hard to determine from certain statistics, and I've never looked at it in that way. It's kind of the questions you ask, and they kind of come natural to you, isn't it? Because when you're in a leadership role, you kind of, if you've walked the talk, let's say, and been in the role yourself and produced at a high level, you start understanding the kind of questions or the things you're looking for. So then you start being able to ask those questions of the people that are now in those roles to be able to help them understand what they should be focused on to improve. Is that what you're saying? Is that?
Yeah, that's kind of true. What reminds me of something that Elon Musk said. It was about his interview process and how he selects people. And he said there's a lot of people that put on their resume that they've done something. And then when you talk to them and you ask them about the details, the challenges and the things that they faced, that many of them can't answer that because they were part of a team and they actually didn't do the work. I think it's the same thing. If you're a manager, just because a salesperson is successful from a numbers perspective you really need to ask and find out what's going on. Because are they lucky? Or is it sustainable? Have they changed a particular behavior? Are they doing something different? And if they can tell you what it is, then you know it's real. If they can't tell you, then you know that maybe it's just a pricing proposal, or maybe it's a bluebird. So getting sustainable changes in behavior and enhancing the skills of the salesperson require an interview process, right? And asking the right questions. And I think if you do that as a manager, you're going to have a better relationship with your sales team as well, because many of the salespeople struggle asking for help, right? If you ask for help, you're saying that you don't know how to do something, and it makes you quite vulnerable. So they'll be resistant to it. They have to know that if they explain the weakness, that you're there to actually help them, and it doesn't mark just against them.
Yeah. What do you have a favorite manager that you've had manage you?
Well, I have a couple. They all have different attributes. One of my favorite actually was my vendor. Then I worked for him, and then he was a customer, and then he worked for me for a period of time, and now he's retired. He was the classic sales manager. He would inspect, he'd ask all the right questions, straight to the point. So he's probably one of my favorite, because I looked at myself as a technical and services leader, and he taught me very much about how to be an effective salesperson. Which, how do you get to yes quickly? Again, how do you negotiate, and how do you put yourself in uncomfortable situations and make them comfortable? He taught me some of those things. Again, an East Coaster, which made it easy for me to relate to. Another guy from New York, New Jersey that liked the New York Yankees. So that was helpful. I had another boss that I absolutely loved in the services group, and he was very funny. He was such a personable guy. The number one thing I remember he taught me was, if you're ill, come into work. He's like, you don't want to take a day off and feel bad. Take days off when you feel great and go have fun. Which is just awful, but I do remember that. He cared so much about you as a person, right? He was just like, cherish your days off, man, and spend it with your family, or do something good. If you're sick, come on, you're a big grown guy. You can come into work. You'll be fine. Very funny. Outside of that, one other boss that I really, really liked was the one who told me to surround myself with people that make me and my life better. And if they don't enhance and drive whatever you have forward, then you should think about eliminating them from your world. I don't know if I do that 100%, but at least having that perspective, I thought was a big learning moment for me. And how you develop relationships in business. Who helps you? Who's enhancing your relationship? And if they're not, why do you have them?
It's interesting that I feel like in business and in life, you quantum leap when you usually with those instances where you meet people, kind of like a mentor, and they help you and give you a different perspective on things. With Channel, I can imagine that you're managing a lot of different product lines, and there's a lot to pay attention to, and you can only focus on so much stuff. For those channel directors that are trying to prioritize what they have, how do you do that? How do you stay
I think
top
it's
of them?
really easy. Yep. Focus on how they make money, because you're in business. The bottom line is it's about making money.
Mm-hmm.
And that may sound shallow at first, but in order to figure out how they make money, you need to understand their value proposition. You need to understand what matters to them. You need to understand their organization and what matters to their customers. And you need to understand the challenges that they're facing so you can help them, because that's the most value you can deliver to them, is enhance their ability to make money and deliver to their customer. So are you increasing their value proposition? Are you increasing or decreasing friction? Are you easy to do business with? Do you change the perspective of the customer? Can you bring them new business? What is it that you're doing to help them make money? So the whole portfolio and products, those are the tactical details that you may need to get to, but you have probably resources that will help you, solution architects, other support operational folks. Some of the biggest thing in making money is also financing and financing growth. So in channels, typically, unless you're dealing with the big players usually, but even there, finance matters and cash matters. So how are you helping them finance growth and understanding that piece? Many salespeople steer away from numbers in finance, and it's actually the number one place you should, if you're challenged by it, that's where you should enhance your skill and learn, is understand the basics of financials and how businesses make money and where your programs can fit and optimize the performance of your channel partner.
Mm.
It becomes much more simple and more clear. We teach a class typically in distribution about why when you go to your customer, your partner with like the latest product or a new program, why do they say no? Or they're not as excited about your new sales initiative as you would hope they would be, or you want them to be. And it typically goes down to either cash flow, risk around profitability, how quickly they can move the product, or so how productive their sales force would be. It's all around how they make money and risk. So you can have the best program in the world, and if it seems risky or it uses up too much working capital or cash, they'll say no.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And sometimes I think people assume a lot. So you just assume, oh yeah, they're gonna know the money comes from this. They should be
Yeah,
excited. But what
yeah,
you're saying is that you need to make it very plain and simple for them to understand where the money's coming from. And when they
yep.
understand that, then they get engaged, they get excited by it, and then
They'll
they
make all the
see.
rest work.
Yeah.
They'll make sure all the rest happens.
With some of the times I've heard that like they welcome on channel partners, right? Only for them to sell once and never again. And it seems to be kind of something that's quite common. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, I used to call it the pack of wolves theory.
Yeah.
So if you throw raw meat to a pack of wolves, all you're doing is training them on a behavior to come by and wait for the raw meat, right? They'll devour it and it'll all be gone.
Mm.
Most, especially startups, but I think many manufacturers, when they're trying to enhance or grow the channel continually says, give me new leads, give me new leads. It's like the number one thing, tell me who to go sell to. And if you do that and just foster and throw them the raw meat, they'll never learn how to do that for themselves. So which means they will always come back or they won't come back. They'll close that one deal and they'll wait for you to throw them some more raw meat or another deal. And that's why you don't see that repeat. So if you do that, you have to have them have a stake in the ground. So when you throw them that one deal, you have to say, okay, now we're going to go through the implementation process. You need to shadow. You need to make the investment. You need to profile the account. You need to write the report at the end that is the headline about the success story. You need to write the case study. You need to get them involved. It's about teaching them to fish type of thing in the most simple way there is. And typically, to get the focus and real commitment from the channel partner is difficult to do. So, what the salesperson will do is find the lead, do all the hard work, throw them the raw meat, and then expect, hey, I gave you a deal, now do the rest. Do it again, do it again. Well, they never did it in the first place.
That makes so much sense. You're kind of incentivizing them to come on board with you, and this rightfully so. You're trying to get their attention, so you say, "Here's the lead. Why don't you close it?" But you're not
Yep,
following through with it. So
yep,
if you're not making sure they meet you halfway, if they don't put in the effort, then it's kind of like a free win. Okay, I'm not using much because I haven't put in much. But if you actually expect them to put in the work, and that work you're expecting them to put in pretty much leads them to another sale, because if they're writing up the case study, they're shadowing you for implementation, they understand the product better, they gain knowledge on the process and what the outcomes are, and they would, off the back of that, write that up and then share that with their additional leads that they get on their side, then it starts to build that foundation.
And that's the difference between training and enablement, right? You're enabling the partner at that point. You're not just training them on your product, because they'll sit through product training and not pay attention and not own it or not be accountable. So you need to not only train them, but enable them through skills, through leads, and make sure the expectations are clear about what you expect afterwards. So I think that's the number one problem, because everybody's you're dying for their focus, right? You're struggling to say, pay attention to me. So you're willing to take anything. So you're overfeeding.
With some technology solutions, there's a lot of product and software updates. With that, it becomes a lot of content to update in terms of the materials to keep it aligned with their partners being able to understand what's going on. But it seems to be very overwhelming, and sometimes it doesn't get done, or things get misplaced and put in the wrong sections, and it causes a lot of confusion. And then there's a lot of dialogue back and forth. I don't know if you've encountered that.
Yeah, we've had engagements with technology partners where that's exactly what we're doing, is just providing the updates to that product documentation.
Yeah.
So I think that struggle, that's just an ongoing struggle, and you have to be ready for the channel, because it does take quite a bit of support. I've had a number of friends that have been the directors or VP of channels for a number of startups, and their biggest challenge is actually internal, letting the founders and maybe investors know the pace at which you should grow your channel. Because if you're not ready with support or documentation or updates on the product or technical support, live or solution and implementation support, you can really damage your long-term growth by not being ready. Because it is always a challenge. You can actually sometimes even engage channel partners I've seen that are some of the most dedicated partners that have some of the skills to actually update the information for the rest of the channel. So you get some frenemy collaboration from your channel at times. You have to invest in them, but they can help provide that if you can't do it internally. So sometimes the manufacturer should just look into their own channel about, instead of just the traditional resale integration lead generation, they may be able to provide a lot more support that you didn't think of.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like it's a chicken and egg scenario. It's like making sure that you grow at the right time. Um, a lot of companies that I've spoken to, they're focused on growing their channel out. Do you have any tips for them? So if you were to grow out your own channel, what would you be focused on?
Yeah, I think what many manufacturers do not do is proper channel segmentation. So really laying out and saying to yourself internally, and then communicating to your partners what role they play. So they put partners in the same bucket as partners, but partners are very unique. And typically, segmentation, you can go from your ISVs or your software providers, you can go from your cloud providers, your system integrators, your true resellers, your call centers, and really understanding what value do they deliver around within your channel and your ecosystem. And then if you do that proper segmentation and that value proposition to your go to market, you'll see the gaps and you'll see where you should or shouldn't grow your channel. And that happens with mature manufacturers as well. I know there's a large chip manufacturer that we did an economic study and some segmentation for them, and found out that they were over distributed in India. And all that was happening was it was driving prices down because there was just unnatural competition. They were over distributed and everybody was fighting for the same business. And it just became a price war and dropped the price in that particular segment. So really understanding channel segmentation, how the players all work, what their value proposition is in your route to market, is crucial, because just general channel growth is probably a misnomer. You have to figure out where in your channel you want to grow, so you're not over indexing on one segment over the other.
I
Does that sound too complicated?
No, it sounds very, very. It's actually giving me food for thought. Even you could take that concept and just look at it from every angle of sales, right? You need to segment your audiences because each audience isn't the same. And when you're able to segment your audience, you're able to communicate better, and you can avoid instances where you have the wrong message to the wrong audience and cause chaos. I mean, over competition sounds like a nightmare if you're getting everyone to battle against the same business and drop their prices on the same product.
Yep. And you can just see your value disappear. And then getting out of that's not easy, right? Because now you have to pick and deauthorize someone that may have been of value to you in the past.
What's your opinion? So there's hardware and software, and there's this constant battle. And I've heard hardware companies looking at software because that's where the money is. So they're looking at how do they look at subscription-based offerings and solutions to tag on to their hardware offering.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that? Is that something that you've come across as well?
Hey, sure. It was a great book, Consumption Economics. Jeffrey Moore is one of, I think, the co-authors. I think instead of worrying about hardware and software, they should just worry about outcome. If you always work from the customer backwards, so whether you're selling hardware or software, I don't believe necessarily that that's just where the money is. If you've mapped to the outcome and you understand your value, that your portion of the value that drives that outcome for the customer, there'll be money in it for you. So what happened with hardware was as technology was evolving, this is a few years ago, but as that was evolving, I think a lot of the hardware manufacturers stopped realizing where they were with the outcome. They thought the outcome was only being driven by the software. And I think there's a convergence now of hardware and software and things that have to work together in order to drive that outcome. Whether or not you possess the hardware or it's in the cloud or you're paying for it, right? I mean, hardware is still tremendous value. Just look at the acceleration with NVIDIA, right? That's hardware. Well, and software, right? I'm sure there's software that's driving those computer chips, obviously. So I think what is the outcome and really looking at that from the customer, it's what's going to determine what value you deliver. So worry about the customer, worry about the outcome. Hardware, software, they all have to work together.
Do you feel there's a different sales process involved in hardware and software?
Yes. I think software typically, because you're engaged from the user interface, that many times the hardware could be a pull. So if this is the software and the application that I want and use, what are the hardware requirements needed to drive that? So many times software can be the pull through, but again, it's starting with the customer again. So what does the customer want? How do they feel? So the sales cycle is a bit different. There's a bit more onus on the software application to deliver the value, right? Are you going to use it every day? Are you going to use all the features and functions and components? And then you can drag the hardware in. So the sales engagement might be different based upon what the customer is trying to accomplish. It could be the other way around, though, because maybe it's a storage issue and they're trying to add to optimize their storage and their storage spend across different types of drive types and optimize what's happening. And then hardware could dictate exactly how you manage it. So there's things in reverse as well. But typically, it's definitely a different sales cycle. And I think the ongoing management, where hardware, you kind of put it in place and you have to maintain it and you don't want it to break. And maybe there's some updates associated with it. When you're selling a software application, I think the initial implementations where you start and then you try to grow and expand much, much more from a software perspective because you're trying to get more usage of your tools.
Yeah. I've heard of this concept. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's like conceptualized sales. So you've got hardware, and when I did door to door, you'd put your brochure, because I was selling Sky TV, into the customer's hands. And it's much like selling glasses. You get the customer to try on the glasses, you put it in their hands, because if they have it and they feel it, it's theirs. They get used to it, and you're more likely to make the sale. When it's conceptual, so when I was starting Ananda, people using LinkedIn, they didn't really understand it if it was a CV or job site. This is 10 years ago. You had to build what there was a principle called Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, which is like you're bridging the gap. It's kind of like, and what I used to relate it to as an exhibition, because people understood exhibitions, it was physical, it's tangible. Do you feel that there's that same element in the hardware and software game, which is that because it's hardware, you can like, hey, here's a phone. Talk to you about this phone. It's yeah,
It's something physical, or whether it's in the cloud or not. I've purchased this, it's mine. I know what the specs are. Where the application or software, it's an intangible, right? I can't touch it, feel it necessarily. Maybe I use it, maybe it's working in the background, right? It's a security. I don't know what it's doing, but I know it's there. Yeah, I think selling the intangibles is a lot like selling services or anything that's outcome that you can't touch and feel. Then you need to be clear back to, I'm going to sound very redundant, back to what's the outcome you're driving with the customer, right? And, depending how tangible that is, I think you have a better time of doing it. If the value to the customer is also something that's tough to define, like risk avoidance or lack of failure, that's why it's so difficult sometimes to sell security or backups or things that are redundant, is because people don't necessarily feel that pain until it happens. Selling insurance, type, for example. So I think the more tangible the outcome is, the better off you are as well.
yeah, yeah. No, you're right. The outcome is, I think, where if you can focus on one thing and one thing alone, that is going to be where you get the result, the most bang for your buck. Let's say,
Yeah.
for sure. The the other thing I wanted to understand, because the the content you put together,
hmm
the last piece you showed me, it was very eye opening because it was very entertaining. Do you believe content for learning purposes has to be entertaining to be effective? Does it maybe depend on what it is? Is there a process you take to decide whether it needs that type of je ne sais quoi, or
Yeah.
what's the process behind that?
Right. When is humor appropriate, right? And when can humor or entertainment actually help with retention? So we
Mm.
like to focus on adult learning principles, and there's six, and don't quiz me right now of what those are, but we do focus on those, and part of those are engagement or relating to the content and the material. So I think when you address humor, it's about engagement and the user making it relatable to their job. So I think if they can identify with a character in a video, or they can identify with a scenario, even especially, and humor helps you to relate to it instead of it being a fake salesperson in a fake hallway or a fake setup, which sometimes is appropriate because it's fine, but humor takes that all away, and now they can relate to the individual. So I think that's where we find humor to break it down, make it very relatable. The user is listening and actually retaining the information because they're thinking about how that actually applies to their job every day and what they experience, and then they'll listen and retain the information. So I like it as well. It's much more enjoyable, as you know, to take any type of e-learning. If there's some humor or there's entertainment, you're more engaged. And to be honest, my team's more engaged, and they enjoy putting that together probably more than any type of dry learning that was a bit more boring. But those learnings are necessary too. That's the tough part. You have to have you can't have humor in everything, and then it starts to lose its value.
Yeah, yeah. You need, can't have sunshine without rain. You need both to appreciate the other, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I think humor is important. And I'll tell you, with our more corporate clients, instead of more on the consumer side, pushing the envelope and forcing them, they all would like to see humor, but it's very difficult for them to actually accept humor because they're concerned about, nobody wants to offend anybody or be a little bit too over the top or be inappropriate. So it's a delicate balance on the corporate side where, as you know, when you watch TV commercials or you're broadcasting stuff across social media, you have a little bit more leeway.
But where do you think, like, do you think that training ventures into marketing? So there's training content. Do you think it ventures into marketing content, or where's that line? Because I've always had a feeling that there is an opportunity where there's there's both at play there. It can be used to upskill the staff and be utilized that way, but it can also be used to attract the attention of the audience that you want.
Yeah. The fundamentals of both are, I think, are the same around education. You're either trying to educate your consumer on the value to them of your product and why they might find it interesting. And then the internal training, you're explaining the value to their customers and how that salesperson can be successful selling their products to their customer and actually help their customers to be successful. So you're trying to educate both of them. The thing is, the motivation's different, right? So if I'm a salesperson, I'm working at this corporation, I know I need to learn this because I want to be successful at my job and I want to make money. When you're doing marketing to a consumer, they can shut it off. They don't care, right? There's no vested interest in that. So that's why you see the increased level of maybe shock value or humor, because you have to engage the customer and make them understand why they should listen and get educated about your product. Where you do have a bit of a captive audience with your internal associates, the training, they want to be there because they need to be there to learn how to do their job successfully. So you have a little bit of a captive audience, and you can make things a bit more dry and more technical because you have that captive audience. And that's why you'll see the entertaining stuff on the marketing side. But fundamentally, and that's why we cross over to product marketing and internal training very well. If we know what the consumer is attractive to the consumer, we can also help the sales teams position when they're presenting with pieces of that in mind, because the corporate client, the end customer, I mean, there's still people, and people buy based on things that happen to them or the benefits to them as a person as much as to the corporation.
Yeah. Do you find that it's easier to create the content if you have already done the learning? Is there a way round that is easier? So if you've done the marketing content first and then you do the learning, or vice versa? I don't know how that goes, but I can
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah, it's because you're more fully ingrained with the product that.
Yeah, for sure. I think once we really understand the value proposition, we can take that value proposition, and because we understand channels, we understand consumers and internal training. Once we understand the value proposition and the positioning of the product, creating those different assets is much, much easier because you're just tweaking it. You have to understand each of the audiences, obviously, but you can take that value proposition and tailor it to your audience. So I think it lends itself, if you can work with one vendor that actually, I think that's where most manufacturers struggle, and we're a bit unique, is most either agencies that you work with don't understand all the audiences. They don't do it. If you do internal training, I just do internal training. I don't relate that to marketing, to the commercial channel or external or even to corporate. I just do training. And then we're a bit unique from that perspective because of our teams, the diversity of our teams, where we have instructional designers that teach training internal, but they work hand in hand with videographers and scriptwriters that write for commercial marketing agencies in their past as well. So we're able to actually hit that whole spectrum where most agencies have specialties.
Yeah, yeah, and for those, I mean, when it comes to training, I think it's one of those things where it's the person who needs it believes in it, but the person who's not affected by it doesn't feel like it's needed.
Well, so we typically break training down, and I think this is where you're going, Alice, but it is, there's probably 5 to 10% of your sales force or marketing teams, whoever you're focused on at that moment for training, that will do the same job and perform the same with training or without. They're just go-getters. And you know people, you're probably one of them, that I'm going to stay up, I'm going to read, I'm going to buy a book that's related to it. I'm curious about the subject. Whether or not I get great internal training or not, I'm going to make sure I'm knowledgeable about this. And that's just a go-getter. Those 10% isn't who you need. They aren't the ones you need to focus on. You want them in your training because they'll enhance the peer-to-peer component, but it's not your focus. And then there's probably 10 to 20% that no matter how much training you invest in them, it's never going to connect. They're either in the wrong role, they're in the wrong industry. They just are the ones that no matter how much you invest, the investment needs to be in helping them find another job that fits better. That's where that investment happens. So now you got 20%, 10%, 30%. There's anywhere between 60 and 70%, let's say, that actually, if they invest in the training and pull away those key little nuggets, one or two nuggets from the training, and change a skill or behavior, you will get a fair amount of movement, let's say a 10 or 20% increase in performance. However, that's the bulk of your force, right? That's 60 to 70% of your people. Moving them 10 to 20% is massive for an organization. And that's how you should structure the outcome you're looking for from training, is how do you move that middle group 10 to 20%?
Yeah, I remember my first ever job. It was 100% commission, but I worked harder there than anywhere else. And I do truly believe because they were the masters of motivation. They had to be. It was 100% commission. But what they did is every morning you'd go through training, and every evening you'd go through training. And they do that every day religiously. Now, into another role, or every other role since, there was no real training. There was maybe a bit here and there, but nothing really there. And it got less and less the bigger the company I got at. And the funny thing is, I remember sitting down in an interview and I said to the guys, what's one thing? They asked me, what's one thing that the employer that you're currently working at could be doing better? And I went, well, I don't get training. And they went, okay, why don't you go out and get your own training and do your own thing? And I was like, I didn't have an answer to that. I was like, that's a good point. I should actually just take control of my own life. But I still think, look, if you're trying to build a good company, that if you have the money to invest in training and you can do proper training, like you said, I think the way you've presented it there helps a lot of people be able to communicate. So my question was like, there's people that are bought in, they're already sold on the training initiative. They want it in, but their problem is that they're trying to communicate how effective this is going to be for the rest of the team. They might be the channel director, but the marketing director's got the budget and they're looking at getting some PR done. Or it may be the operations director or the finance director that's looking at other initiatives. And it's like, how do you win them over? And I think you've done a beautiful job in explaining that. Look, there's a portion of your workforce that are go-getters, but there's also a portion, a significant portion that if you help them out, they would perform multiples better, and that would in turn make quite a big significant change.
Because if you think about it, where do managers typically focus their energy? They're going to pay attention to their high performers, right? Because they don't want them to go anywhere. And then they pay attention to their underperformers because they're trying to figure out what's wrong. And the people in the middle get the least amount of attention. But that's actually where you're going to, if you focus there, stop focusing on the underperformers and just get them out. Enable the top performers, give them free reign, let them go because they can. Focus on that middle group, you'll actually see bigger movement. But it's exactly opposite where most managers spend their time.
Yeah, I think also if you've got a good content game and community that you've built around the sellers, that they can become advocates and they can even increase the amount of people that come on board and work with you, and you can reward that. So that, like, it all stems from content, because if you don't have that springboard to make it easy to be able to do that, then you're just asking those 10% of performers to be complete out of this world go-getters and do that all for you, and it's just not going to happen. And you can empower so many more people to be able to do that. So it's really awesome to hear that from you.
I used to, when I worked in distribution, one of my recommendations was the third highest salesperson rule, which was if you go to your partner and try to convince the top salesperson to sell your product or your offer versus what they're doing, fat chance. They're the number one salesperson. They're not going to make a change. And number two wants to be number one. So they're going to do whatever number one does, and they're trying to beat them the whole time. Number three has nothing to lose because he or she is number three. They're looking for something different. Tell me how I can kill it without doing what these guys are doing, because they're doing that. They're already number one and two. They're better at it than I am. What is it that you have that can accelerate my growth? So it's sort of like you go after, even as a manager, you go after that number three and start showing success. Then number 2 turns around, whoa, what's going? Number 1 does too, and you can start to gain momentum. So I think if you're going to get an advocate, showing someone that was struggling, taking your training and enablement, using the tools, following through, and showing tremendous success, probably has more traction than your number 1 person saying, "Yeah, the training was great. You should take it," right? Because
That is
nobody
powerful.
believes it.
Yeah, because it's the Rocky story, isn't it? It's the hero's journey. You get to actually demonstrate it, and people who are either feeling a little bit underconfident or just self-aware, whatever may be going on, and they know they're not number 1, it helps them to go, do you know what, this guy, I can be like this guy. This guy, he was like me. He started out and he's able to outperform these killers, these absolute killers that had the skill set, that had the natural ability, but this one, he followed this protocol. I think that's a very powerful message that you can distribute to an organization, for sure. Yeah, these are some strategic insights that I think are going to be useful for a lot of people out there. But it was really good, cool. This one, I really enjoyed it.
See you in a bit, man.
Cool, cool, man.